I'm Hillary Hill. I work in our Central Coast region. I'm our Deputy Regional Manager for the Central Coast. And helping to lead this webinar today, we have Hannah and Vanessa as well. Can you guys introduce yourself?
Hi there, I'm Vanessa. I'm a project manager in the SF program.
Hello everyone, Hannah Barty. I'm a project manager in the North Coast for the Coastal Conservancy.
Great. So we'll be tag teaming, giving this presentation today and answering your questions. I'm hearing some feedback, so folks can mute your microphones, or Vanessa, if you can help out with that. The goal of today's webinar includes helping you to start and manage your Coastal Conservancy grant. And our intended audience is new grantees, but also is a good refresher for returning grantees to answer any questions as you have them. So let me get started on our slides here. First, congratulations on receiving a grant from the Conservancy, and we thank you for the work you do, and we're really excited to fund your project. Everything we're covering today is also outlined in our grantee manual, which is found on our website under the grants tab, and then under resources for grantees. And I can do a demo of where that is at the end of our session today to show you where these resources are found. I'm going to quickly touch on acquisition projects as they have a slightly different process than the rest of our grants, which we'll be going over for the remainder of the portion. And we did have a few acquisition projects approved at our November board meeting, so wanted to just briefly go over that. Grantees for acquisition projects should set up a time with your Conservancy project manager to discuss this process. But in general, the flow chart here is that you will get your grant agreement executed, and then you'll work on providing acquisition documents to the Conservancy for review, which is a long list here that includes an appraisal, preliminary title report, environmental assessment, purchase and sale agreement, a grant due to conservation easement, baseline conditions report. If it's an easement, a monitoring and reporting plan, a sign plan, the Conservancy's offer to dedicate, escrow instructions, and the preliminary closing statement. Once all those items are finalized, then the grantee can submit an invoice request letter to the Conservancy. And we have a template for this. And that should be done at least 20 business days before the close of escrow to allow enough time for processing. And then the check is mailed directly into escrow for the close of the acquisition. So that's just a brief highlight of that process, but we have additional resources for acquisition grantees. And so your project manager will be providing those a checklist and some other resources to go through that process. So that's our brief acquisition introduction. The remainder of the presentation will go over the grant process for all our other types of grants, planning, implementation, etc. But wanted to take a pause there if there are any questions about acquisition projects. And feel free, if you have questions, to raise your hands or put them in the chat. Vanessa and Hannah will be monitoring the chat. So let's see, any questions for acquisition projects? And again, your project manager is who will be leading you through the details of all these different requirements. Okay, I don't see anyone. So I will move on. Okay, so this is the flow chart for all our other types of grants. And this graphic provides a high-level process of each of the steps we'll be going through. And we'll pause after each of these sections for questions. So feel free, as you have questions, to put them in the chat or raise your hand at the end of the section, and we'll go over those. So we'll be starting with the grant agreement, which is the grant agreement is between your organization and us, and your project manager will draft this for you. And this outlines the terms and conditions of the grant. There's some typical grant conditions we have, which are outlined in the grantee manual. So please let them know if your project manager know if you have any questions, and make sure you read the terms before you sign it. The first step of the process is filling out a payee data record, which is the standard 204 form. Your project manager will provide that to you to sign in DocuSign. And you need a new 204 form, even if you've had a conservancy grant before. We need those new for each grant. And this provides the state your address for where the reimbursement checks will be sent to. So it's important the address and the legal name is right on the payee data form. It's a very simple one-page form. And we need that before processing your grant agreement. And when your project manager is drafting your grant agreement, it's important to discuss your project schedule with them. There'll be 3 dates in your grant agreement. The completion date, which is when all work needs to be completed by, the final request for disbursement date, usually a month later than that. That's when all invoices and paperwork needs to be wrapped up. And then the termination date, which is when the grant agreement will close. You may be able to extend out these dates with an amendment once you get started, but we prefer to try to give some flexibility within the original dates to reduce the number of amendments that are needed. And for the work completion date, no work can be completed after the completion date that you will bill to. So that's kind of like the hands up, can't work anymore date. And yeah, for the termination date, usually for like planning projects, that's about 3 months after the completion date. But for construction projects, that will be 20 years after the completion date to give us 20 years within the maintenance and operation agreement. Your grant agreement will have a number identifying it to you. It starts with a G, then a 2-digit number followed by a 3-digit number. And so that will be your reference number for what your grant agreement number is. And the project manager will provide that for you. So that is an overview of the grant agreement. Were there any questions anyone has on the grant agreement? And you should not start any work before the grant agreement and some other steps that we're going to show you happen that you want to get reimbursed for. So do not start work that you want us to reimburse before you have these secured.
There are no questions in the chat, and I don't see any hands up, but if you do have a question, please feel free to either unmute or raise your hand.
So the next step in the process is the conditions precedent. Hannah is going to describe that section.
Yeah, so for conditions precedent, and we'll go to the next slide. This is after you have signed that grant agreement. You can now start on the conditions precedent. The grant has been executed, but you cannot start work, like Hillary was talking about, until all of the documents listed here have been approved. We'll go over these in more detail now, and these will also be detailed in your grant agreement. The first document is the board resolution. This resolution tells us that your governing body has agreed to enter into this agreement with the Conservancy and identifies who will sign the grant agreement. There's a template online, but you may have your own version of this board resolution that you would like to use instead. Our next document is insurance, and insurance requirements may differ according to your grant. So they may be different if it's an acquisition project versus a planning or construction project. So check with your project manager, and they will also be listed in your grant agreement for these insurance requirements. For those who are returning grantees, we have changed the requirements for insurance. So we require $2 million in liability for construction and $1 million in liability for planning. The State Coastal Conservancy also no longer needs to be listed as the certificate holder. We just need to see the proof of insurance. You may need bonding or a lien release depending on your project if it's a construction project, and only if you contract with someone for more than $20,000. If you need specific insurance for this grant and it increases your premium, you can charge your conservancy grant for that extra charge. Make sure that if that's the case for you, you talk with your project manager about this. So on the next slide, we have a list of common insurance minimums. We talked about general liability already, but here are the minimums for automobile liability, workers' compensation, watercraft liability, course of construction, or property insurance. But of course, these will be dependent on your grant. For instance, if you aren't using a watercraft for your grant, you don't need to get watercraft liability insurance. Again, talk to your project manager or refer to your grant agreement to see which specific types of insurance you're required to hold. And we're going to pause here. It looks like we might have had a little activity in the chat. Vanessa, if you're able to read out and call on hands.
Yeah, I do have a question. I think Claire would like to ask a question about the grant resolution.
Yeah, I don't know how hard it is for you to go back 3 slides. You had an example. Thank you. I appreciate it. First of all, I just want to make sure I understand the order of operations here. The grant agreement, I was reading it before this meeting, so I'm going to sign that, and then my board of trustees will do this resolution. That's correct, right? That's my first question. That's
Yes, that's
okay. Thank you. And then the authorizes a designated person. Sorry, there's a lot people who have managed a lot bigger grants, but I have a question about that. So is the designated person going to be a staff person or a board member? Can you just clarify that for me?
It depends on you, how your organization is set up and who is authorized to enter into agreements. Sometimes there's delegated authority like that a board of an organization has to like their executive director or someone else to sign agreements, but it is dependent on the rules of your organization.
Totally. I think in our case, it will be a staff person. So essentially this document, the sample resolution, is telling y'all at the State Coastal Conservancy that that person is allowed to do that. So that makes sense. Thanks, guys. That's it.
Yeah. And just to clarify, the resolution can happen before the grant agreement. So it can happen before or after, and the language might just be modified to reflect that.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
And we do have one more question from Joe Scriven. Will bonding requirements include payment bond and performance bond?
The bonding requirement is dependent on your grant, and that's for construction grants only. So I would refer to your project manager to provide that language specific to your grant in that.
Great. That is all the questions in the chat, and I don't see any hands up.
All right, so next up, we'll talk about the work program. So the work program is a project roadmap, and on the next slide, we'll have a little bit more information about what's included in that. This roadmap defines the tasks, deliverables, project schedule, and task level budget for the project. It tells us how you'll complete the project, and it may take a few drafts and reviews by your project manager. We'll have the template, or we do have the template on our website, and when you open it up, you'll see instructions on how to fill out the work program in orange text on there to give you some guidance as you're going through the drafting of it. And this is a working document, a living document that can be modified. So if during the project something changes and you need to make changes to your work program, you would contact your project manager requesting that change, and can then receive their approval for a work program update. On the next slide, we'll go into a little bit more detail for the components of the work program. So the first part is the project description, which provides a concise, high-level summary of your project, stating its goals and what will be done to achieve them. It typically can be about 1 paragraph, like you see in this example, but more complicated projects, you're welcome to have a longer project description. Use the description from your grant agreement or from the staff recommendation for the grant as a starting point, because it'll generally have that high-level summary in there. And next, you will define the scope of work by task. You can use subtasks to help you stay organized, but you want these to match up to how you'd like to invoice, because you will only bill for activities using the overall task, so not by subtask. Overall categories of tasks can include things like project management, grant management, design, environmental review, permitting, implementation, monitoring, community engagement, tribal engagement, to name a few. But you can work with your project manager to tailor the tasks to fit your project and keep your invoicing organized in that way. And then for each task, you will also define deliverables, which are documents that you will turn in to the project manager. So in the work program schedule, you will provide an overall schedule for the project by task. And here's an example of a schedule where you can see that you use that task number that we were just talking about, task title, and then the deliverables from the scope of work above, providing an estimated start and completion date for each item. This table will be then copied to the progress report to track deliverables, but a little bit more on that later. So for the work program, you're also going to be inputting a budget. And remember that simplicity in this budget allows for flexibility. This budget is critical for invoicing and will, similar to the overall schedule, will be copied into your request for disbursement. A simple budget like this one just shows that task title and the task number from your scope of work. And please make sure that you're working with your project manager on this budget section within your work program. The next section will be on the budget details. So this is where you go into a little bit more detail and talking about, the things that you need to list out, like food, equipment, or travel, as some examples. And your project manager will use this to make sure that all costs and activities billed for align with your approved work plan. Please note that all organizations that receive funding from the Conservancy are required to meet strict accounting standards. While rare, there's always the possibility of an audit, so it's the responsibility of all our grantees to use the generally accepted accounting principles published by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants. And if you're worried about where to find these pieces of information, they are in our grantee manual that we have on our website that we'll share a little bit later again. Another reminder for labor costs. In the work program, you don't need to provide us information about hourly rates or number of hours worked in the work program. However, you will provide that information as backup documentation when you submit an invoice for labor costs. For stipends, cash payment is allowed, but not things like gift cards, gas cards, or transit passes. So please check with your project manager early if you plan to use stipends in your project. For indirect costs, these can't be more than 20% of your overall grant. Again, please make sure to work with your accountant to come up with an indirect rate that can be backed up in case of an audit. For subcontractors, you will need to provide the name of the subcontractor and a description of their work for approval from your Coastal Conservancy project manager. And then finally, the plan for acknowledgement that's within your work program. The Conservancy would like to be acknowledged in physical acknowledgements, such as in signage, as we're seeing here with this surfboard signage, and in communication materials, like this social media post that mention your project. This gives us funding recognition to help ensure that future funding is made available to our programs. More awareness and showing the good work that goes on with these grants, the better for everyone. And we understand, overall, for this work program and for all of the conditions precedent that we've talked about today, that these may take up a lot of staff time. So talk to your project manager about charging some of your staff time to your grant before you get your start work letter, if this is going to be a burden on you. So again, reach out to your project manager for more information on that. That wraps up the conditions precedent. So we're going to pause for questions.
No questions in the chat room. We have one. I think Elvira could go ahead and unmute.
Yes, good afternoon to all, and thanks for taking my question. About the phases of project, if we are in preliminary going for the study and we're doing just the study portion of the encumbrance, or for 2 million, then we're just going for the work program that we submitted for phase 1. And completion date for that is just tied in to the completion of that study, or I have to go with the approved date of the whole 2 million. That's for the phase of the design and construction.
For the grant agreement, it would be the date of the whole amount that you're encumbering for the grant. But for the work program, if
Yeah.
it's a specific task, that in the work
Okay.
program task, you would do the date for that preliminary phase. But for
Okay,
the grant
so
agreement, you would want
the
to
whole
make
thing.
sure that grant doesn't end before all the work you want to do is completed.
Okay. And then secondly, on the direct cost, overhead is allowed, right? I
Yeah,
didn't
we
see
use
any.
indirect cost and overhead interchangeably. So
Okay.
going back to that, you can do up to 20% of the total grant cost.
Okay, 2020. And it's in the grant manual too.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And we do have one more question. Should acknowledgement to Coastal Conservancy appear in job description announcement? Or, yeah, go ahead, Hillary.
That can kind of be up to your project manager. I would say it would be more in more public facing avenues. But you can talk to your project manager about what works for your grant. Great. I think we can move on to the next section, which is starting work. Vanessa, you want to take it away?
I'll take it away. Thanks, Hillary. Thanks, Hannah. Okay. And next slide, please. So it is precedent. Done. Hold on, sorry. Getting a little. All right. Now start work. Section. We'll move on to that. And next slide, please. Okay, so once all the conditions precedent to disbursement or just conditions precedent have been received and approved, those are all the documents that Hannah just went over. Your PM, your project manager, will send you a start work letter or a notice to proceed, and this is what you see here on your screen. Once you receive this letter, you can then begin work that will be billed to your grant. And take note of the date that's on this letter, which is circled in red. And this is an important date because you do not want to invoice for work prior to this date. So I'm just going to do a quick pause here. Any questions about this letter? All right, great. Oh, I do see one. This is from Juliana.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, is the start work letter the same as like the official award letter, or are those separate?
We don't have a separate award letter. So the official communications you'll get is the grant agreement executed and signed by all parties. And then the start work letter is the next formal approval that you can proceed with the grant.
Okay, and the grant agreement document, those haven't been sent out yet, correct?
Some may have, but you should talk to your project manager. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So you started your work. Awesome. And next slide, please. So this next section, we're going to talk about invoicing and progress reports. So this is important to track your project and how you also get paid. So you've already completed some work and you'll figure out, how do I get paid for this work? And so to get reimbursed for your project expenses, we ask that you invoice no less than quarterly, so like every 3 months, or no more than monthly. And so you may not invoice for work prior to the start date of that project, so which is that the date, the notice to proceed. And so your invoice, it consists of 3 items. It's your progress report, your request for disbursement or RFD, and your backup documentation. And I'll be going over those 3 items in the next slides. And so all these documents would be combined into a single PDF, and you would email it to our invoices department to invoice@scc.ca.gov, and also CC your project manager so they can also review the documents and they're aware that you had submitted an invoice as well. And next slide, please. Oh, actually, my apologies. If you could go back then. Thank you. So also in terms of your deliverables, you would send those directly to your project manager in a separate email, and also a note for the future. Invoices cannot cross fiscal years. So the fiscal year is, it begins July 1st and ends the following June 30th. So you can bill through June 30th, 6/30, and the next invoice would need to start 7/1. So your invoice cannot cross June and July in one invoice. And please, next slide. Thank you. So on this slide, this is your progress report. You will provide updates per task during that billing period. You would discuss your current status of the project, the work that has been done, any challenges, and any successes during that time frame. And we also do have a progress report template that you may use. It can be found on our website and also in the Grantee manual. And also, we do love photos and stories, and you don't need to put that into the invoice, but send it directly to your PM. Great. And next slide, please. So here we have an example of the request for disbursement, that RFD form, and there are 2 pages. We have the first page here. The left, it covers the summary of expenses from the billing period, and the second breaks down each expense. And so we have this form in both PDF and Excel format, and this can also be found on our website. And so this is the page 1 of that RFD. And again, this page summarizes all those expenses from that specific billing period. So it's circled on the top left, that's the address, which must match the address that's listed on the STD 204 or the payee data record form. And again, this is the address where checks will be sent to, and your project manager will send this to you soon if you haven't already. And if you'd like to have those checks mailed to a different address, like a PO box, you could just ask your project manager about filling out an STD 205 form in addition to that STD 204. The task number and name and budget must also match the approved work program. If task 1 is project management, then that left side should also say task 1 and project management. The task budget includes that allotted amount for that specific task. And the cost incurred this period is the amount that is expended, the total cost to date, and finally, the remaining balance for each task is there. We withhold 5% and sometimes 10% of each invoice, and that withholding will be returned to you in your final invoice at the end of your grant. Slide, please. Okay, and so here we have page 2 of that RFP. Again, as mentioned earlier, this further really breaks down those expenses that were listed on page 1. All expenses require you to also submit backup documentation except labor. So the first section that we see is at the top is section A, is your direct costs. And section B is labor. So just further down, right underneath, that is where you would list each title, the hourly rate, the number of hours worked, and the task number. And you wouldn't need to submit any timesheets for this. but you would need to keep those in case of an audit that happens. And then we have section C, which is the indirect cost. And this is where the indirect cost percentage must match the indirect cost rate that is listed on your work program. And then finally, we have section D, that is your subcontractor charges. You'll list the company name, the invoice number, the amount, and then you would also attach that invoice as backup documentation. The grand total at the bottom of this page should match the total from the first page prior to the withholding. Next slide, please. So here we have RFD examples of backup documentation. Also, just to note, you must include paid receipts for your materials and supplies. Online purchases must show shipped on that document. Bank statements are not sufficient backup documentation, and so please remember to save all your receipts. Next slide, please. So travel reimbursement can be found on our website, and to better support our grantees, we've recently updated our travel rates. If you've been awarded a grant with us before, be sure to also check out these new rates. We reimburse personal vehicle mileage costs at 0.67 cents per mile, and so this rate is still the state rate. And here the table shows an example of how to document mileage reimbursement and also include the date, the location, the mileage, and also the total amount. We can, or also travel can be reimbursed for gas with receipt and the cost of a rental car. Our lodging rates now match the federal rate, and so which is higher than the state rates. And this information can be found on our travel reimbursement page, found on our website. We've also updated our lodging rates, which now also, just that. Okay, food is now $60 a day. That's the cap, instead of various amounts per meal, which was what we did before. And so we can also pay for parking fees and tolls that are incurred during your project. And next slide, please. Let's see. So this slide showcases our subcontractors and the backup documentation. And your subcontractors, they provide a service for the project. And for the invoices, they must include the description of the work completed and how much it costs for that work that was completed. And then we also do have some examples of the types of subcontractors on this slide, such as a cultural resource specialist, a community engagement specialist, a design consultant, and also engineers. And any project-related accounting or technical assistance as well. And next slide. So we do also offer the Advanced Payment Fund Program. And typically our grants are reimbursement based. So meaning grantees incur the costs and then we reimburse. So we have a somewhat new-ish program created in response to the needs of grantees, and particular smaller nonprofit organizations who may be unable to cover the upfront costs of a project, as it may lead to a burden. And so Conservancy will prioritize these recipient grantees serving disadvantaged, low income, and under-resourced communities or organizations with modest reserves and potential cash flow issues. So please talk to your project manager if you are interested in this program. So I know that was a lot of information, so I'm going to pause right there and see if we have any questions. I do see some in the chat already. And thank you, Hillary.
There's one question about asking if gas receipts are reimbursed with rental cars, and that is correct. You can either do a rental car and gas receipts, or if you use like your organization's vehicles, you would then use the mileage rate.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you.
Okay,
I'm
there's
not
no
seeing any other hands.
Move on to the next. So finally, now that you've completed your project, how does it all get closed out? First, we'd love to stay involved in your project. And so for implementation projects, it's typically required for the project manager to conduct a site visit at the end of the project to view the completed work. So you should schedule that with your project manager. And for other types of projects, we ask you invite us to any closing events, such as a community event or press release. And then the next step is submitting your final request for disbursement or RFD and your final progress report to your project manager. And this should include in your final progress report any remaining expenditures and all deliverables that you have not previously submitted that are outlined in your work program. And you'll want to make sure that you check this box with the arrow at the bottom that says final invoice, because we will release your withholding. All the 5% withholdings that we have withheld from your previous invoices will be dispersed with that final invoice. And so it's pretty simple for the project completion. You'll be in communication with your project manager to outline any last steps or items we need from you. But checking your work program for deliverables and completing your final request for disbursement and progress report are the last steps. Are there any questions on project closeout? Okay. No. So the question in the chat is, do we include the coastal project manager's trip to project completion in our budget? We pay for that expense, so that's not in the grantee's budget. Any other questions? Okay. So here, there are many guidance documents and templates and examples on our website under resources for grantees, as well as our technical assistance page. So I can show you now, here's an example of some forms that are linked. And then we can wrap up and see if there's any other overarching questions. So let me bring up our webpage here. Okay, this is the Coastal Conservancy's webpage, scc.ca.gov, and under grants here, we have resources for grantees, and this is where our grantee manual lives. We also have a recording of our this webinar from our last board meeting in September. We have links to where our logo can be downloaded for if you have signage or recognition that you want to do. We have a post-grant survey that your project manager will also send out at the end of your grant to see if you have any feedback for us about how to improve our processes. For Explore the Coast projects, we have some additional guidance. And then as you get ready for your first invoice, we have all the invoicing instructions again here listed out with links to the request for disbursement and progress report templates and where you need to send those and whatnot. So this is a helpful resource as well. But the grantee manual, if you go into here, it provides a list of questions you can go through and then that index of forms at the end here. But your project manager is a really helpful resource. If you have any questions, they can point you to where, if we have a template for a form that you need, they can help you through that process. We know it's a bit confusing with all the forms and, especially invoicing. Definitely work closely with your project manager as you have questions. So I think that's it for today. We really appreciate you guys joining and are excited to get your project started. We'll, open it up to any questions, any of the materials or other lingering questions folks have. Great. Well, yeah, don't hesitate to reach out to your project manager or anyone else at the Conservancy if you have questions or need assistance. So thank you all for your time, and we'll send out this recording and links to the presentation and resources after. Yeah, we do have one question.